Welcome to week 7, everybody. We will be covering chapter 6. The topic is stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. And while we've already gotten a good sort of briefing on stereotyping in previous chapters, this one really dives a little deeper and looks at stereotyping as the root to a lot of prejudice and discrimination. So we're going to be building off of previous chapters that we've talked about, particularly social cognition, social perception, and attitudes, which we just finished, building on some of those principles and ideas of where our attitudes, where our biases tend to come from, and now implementing them and looking at them in the context of prejudice and discrimination. So here is your to-do list for this week. Your chapter objectives. There's a lot of terminology in this chapter, so make sure that you're kind of picking through it carefully, maybe making note cards as you go, so as not to forget what certain things mean, because there's definitely a lot covered here. We'll start just by pointing out the differences between what stereotypes are and then prejudice and discrimination. Looking at inequality between differing groups is sort of the starting base that we start from. And whenever we have inequality, it can lead to stereotypes. And so we'll look at how those can operate, what elements are involved there, how it's related to things like schemas and negative emotions, and then the result, tokenism, what the implications of tokenism are, and you might have covered some of this if you've taken learning or you've taken intro psych. Often we cover tokenism. Token economy is another sort of word for it. But basically looking at this, idea that our standards are shifting in terms of what members of what groups we stereotype. It depends on the times, it depends on the area, historically what's happening in our country. So we'll look at the subjective and objective use of scales to try to pinpoint our stereotypes. And then we'll start getting into comparing some different ideology of where those stereotypes come from. Things like in-group differentiation and out-group homogeneity. These are ways that we categorize ourselves with other groups, and how this then can lend itself to stereotypical representation of any groups that are not like our own. It'll talk about other types of stereotyping in terms of sexism. So we tend to think of like all the isms, sexism, racism, heterosexism, and so this really gets to the basis of like, where does that come from? Looking at different cognitive stems of differential treatment. And if we think of, stereotypes and how they lend to prejudice, prejudice is really just prejudging someone based on a stereotype, based on minimal information or false information, whatever information you have readily available. So prejudice is the thought, the idea. Discrimination is the act of carrying that out. So we'll look at both very overt displays of discrimination and then more subtle forms of discrimination, specifically in the workplace. We'll look at glass ceiling and glass cliff. This is sexism, basically concepts related to sexism. Looking at how females are portrayed in the media, and then starting to get into some of the theories as to why prejudice exists. For example, we are threatened. We are often threatened. We just covered not too long ago the chapter on the self, and we know that there are many elements that exist to threaten one's self-esteem, self-worth. When we feel threatened, we tend to project that outwards onto others, and we look for groups to target. When we're competing for resources, i.e. jobs, scholarships, Anything that we're in competition with other groups for, we start to pit ourselves against those groups. Whoever we see as an out group is not our group, whereas the in group is our group, and this leads to social categorization. So we'll be looking at some of the research behind that, looking at old-fashioned racism versus sort of more modern racism and the ways that we see that, talking about collective guilt and moral disengagement, looking at implicit racial attitudes. These are racial attitudes we're not even aware that we have. One specific way that we can measure that is through the implicit association task. I've included a video this week that describes what this is, and it kind of walks you through it and shows you how it works, how we can tap into the sort of unconscious mind that we all possess, and get to the core of how we might really be feeling and we're not even aware. Some things that are just classically conditioned into us that we're not even consciously aware that we do, ideas and opinions that we hold. And then we'll start looking at ways to reduce prejudice. And so this is also part of your discussion question for the week. There have been many studies looking at, different theories and different ways of how we can start to understand the origins of prejudice. And if we understand the origins, we can start to try to reduce it. What types of things help in that process? Realistic conflict theory lends some information there, so you want to be reading about that. And then just understanding some things that we've already talked about, like ultimate attribution error, fundamental attribution error, social identity theory. We just covered those in the last chapter, very relevant here to understanding why it's so hard to get rid of a prejudice. And then social learning view is also going to kind of lend some information there on how our attitudes even develop in the first place when it comes to other racial or ethnic groups. And lastly, some hope for how to reduce it would be through contact hypothesis, and just kind of bringing people to the same level, getting people to interact more together and embrace differences and realize similarities, and getting people to communicate with one another instead of communicating based on stereotypes. Your reading for this week is Article 16. It has to do with hate and hate groups and some of the origins behind that. So I want you integrating into your discussion this article, as well as the chapter and some of the videos. So let's scooch on down here. We've got the lecture slides. You're going to be watching this video from Jane Elliott, looking at her third grade classroom. Back in the 60s, she did a study with her third graders. It was a pivotal study. Some of you may have actually learned about this in school. If you took social studies in school, you might have covered this. I think that's middle school. Pivotal study, just looking at, where do prejudices come from? And her argument is that a lot of it is learned, that we're not born prejudiced, that it comes from who we model. Another quick video, this one here, homophobia in the media. So really media's role in perpetuating stereotypes that discriminate against certain groups. We'll look at, here's the IAT video, looking at the implicit biases we have when it comes to certain people groups and sort of why we are biased, where that bias comes from. And then we're going to be watching a feature movie this week. It's Crash. Great movie. I think you all are really going to like it. It's one of my favorite movies. And I've put some questions to consider, some things to be thinking about, but there's an assignment that goes with it, with video questions. So once you're going to want to download these video questions, have them near you. Once you've watched the film, you can go ahead and fill that out, and you're going to submit it by clicking here and attaching your document. Okay, so it's a Word document. You can write on it, and then you can save it, and you can send it through to this video assignment, which is due Saturday. Okay, so that'll get you all finished. And then you have your discussion board. It's sort of integrating all of that this week. Integrating the Article 16, the IAT video, and then asking you to pull in the crash video. And I want you pulling also from the chapter. Support what you're saying by concepts from the chapter. When I ask you, what are the origins of prejudice and what research is there to show how we reduce it, here's where I want you going to the textbook. Where does the text say prejudice comes from? Where does the text say how we can reduce prejudice? What ways can we employ? What can we do? What can be done? You're going to want to cite those examples from the textbook, okay? So this is text heavy, and then this is video, text and video heavy, and then this is really the article and the IAT video, okay? You're also citing examples in here from the crash video. I want you listing people and using them as examples. So the great thing about the video is you can stop it, you can pause it, you can go back. There are several characters, as you can see. You might have trouble keeping up with all their names. I mean, look at this list of just all these people in this movie. But, you know, that way, if you need to watch a certain scene a couple times to get the names or who people were, that might be a good idea. That's your discussion. And then you have an exam, exam 3, and it covers chapters 5 and 6. That also closes by Sunday, 10:20. And something to just remember that if you start the exam, you know, at 11:35, it's going to close you out by 11:59. The exam's going to stop and close wherever you are. So you want to make sure you're leaving enough time. You get 30 minutes to take the test. So at 11:29 is really, you can't start it any later unless you plan on finishing in less than 30 minutes. So just make sure of that. You don't want to be cut short by pulling it too close to the due date time. Okay. That finishes up the week. It is a busier week. A lot going on. This is a very heavy chapter. Lots of info here. So as you're going through, please let me know, if you have any questions or anything. I'd be happy to answer those. Otherwise, have a great week, everybody.